Welcome back to another Excel VBA tutorial. So we're continuing our discussion on connection objects. So these are workbook connection objects. And so in our last video, we kind of introduced the topic by basically getting right to the meat of it, adding a connection to our workbook, understanding what that process looked like, and just having a little bit of a better idea of, what is a connection? When we do all this kind of fancy data connection, what is it doing? How does it work? What do we need to specify when we're creating these connections? And we learned that it can actually be a pretty complicated topic depending on what type of connection you're working with and what exactly you're trying to import. And there's definitely a lot of opportunities to make a mistake and have something that should work all of a sudden not work because you're missing something like a comma, a semicolon, or something like that. So now that we have a little bit more, I would say, comfort level with connection objects, I do now want to go on to one of our next topics, which is basically working with the Workbook Connections collection. I'm going to be doing this all night. So basically, the collection is just a group of individual workbook connection objects. Now, we know from our previous video that a workbook connection can be very different depending on the data source that it is connected to. So for example, if I'm connected to an OLEDB data source, then I have an OLEDB connection type. Now, there are other ones. Some of those other ones are older ones, and so they're not necessarily maintained as much. And so even though you can access it from VBA, it's not really suggested anymore. But the idea behind it is there's a whole bunch of different types of connections, and each one of them have their own little unique properties and methods that might go with it. Now, normally there is some kind of common functionality to it, but it does allow for a certain level of uniqueness to each one of our connection objects. So with that being said, I actually have some connections already made into my workbook. So if I go to my existing connection object, you can see that we have Excel Workbook, stock database, that's in SQL one, a Power Query one, and I think I actually need one more to get it off the ground. So this is for a text connection. Okay, perfect. Text connections are a little bit more complicated, but we now see that there's a company data connection. So I don't think I gave that one a description. I don't know. There probably was a reason why I didn't give it a description, but sometimes I have a reason, sometimes I don't. It really just depends. I think with this one, I think it's just because the connection itself isn't really that complicated. I don't know. I'll figure it out later. Regardless, so the first thing that you're going to want to do is you want to make sure that you go to your developer tab, like in most of my videos. So you want to make sure you're on developer tab of your ribbon, click that Visual Basic icon, a new window will pop up, and then you want to make sure you insert a module. So if you just go to your little modules folder under your VBA project related to your workbook, you can just right click, go to that little insert button, and then module. And then from here, you do need to create a new subroutine. So this is basically going to be housing all of our codes and our statements. Give it something meaningful. So I called it working with connections. Now, because this is a video, I had a video at the end, but make it something meaningful. So from here, a lot of it is just understanding what type of connections are out there. So I do have some I would say, notes for us. We're not going to necessarily do anything really coding to it yet, but it's just good to know what is out there. And so if you ever do want to look about this topic in more detail, I did provide a documentation link, but all this documentation link leads to is just an overview of the different types of connections out there. Now, for just so you're aware, I haven't actually worked with every single one of these connections, but for some I have. So for example, a data feed connection. I've never worked with this one, so I personally don't know how to set it up. I have to do a little bit more research on this one just because I don't think I even have any examples to really go off of, but I've never used this one, but it is a connection type that is out there if you want it, and it's called data feed. So from my understanding is it's some type of way where you can feed data in on a continuous basis. So that's, I guess, the idea behind it at a very high level. Now, this one I did work with. It's a connection type model. So this is referencing the power pivot model. So it actually has its own unique connection type from the VBA object model. No source is a little bit of an interesting one. So that's just basically, it wasn't specified. It's kind of the fits everybody, but nobody really at the same time. I don't really know of any examples where I've seen this, but it's there if you need it. Additionally, we have an ODBC connection type. So this is for usually some type of ODBC data source. Normally too, that they kind of have their own unique drivers that go along with it. The OLEDB connection type, well, we covered that in our last video. So this can go to SQL databases. This can go to Excel workbooks. Really just depends, but there's a lot of different types of OLEDB data sources out there. A text connection is actually for a text file. A web connection is for a URL. So these ones right here are more specific to what is the word? The legacy wizard. So this is something where those two are more related to the legacy wizard. So these are no longer, I would say, actively used. The idea is that you would go to Power Query in order to kind of, replicate that functionality. Additionally, there is a worksheet connection. Even though this seems like a common one, I can't really see of an instance where I've used it before. But the idea is that, again, it is a connection to an individual worksheet. It's not really an OLEDB connection just because that's kind of its own little unique thing, but there's probably something in it where if you're maybe even doing something from Power Query or something like that, that this might actually come in handy. Additionally, we do have what we call an XML map connection type. So with that particular one, it is basically an XML document, and then you're basically saying how that XML document is structured. So again, this one I would say is not really heavily used anymore. This is really something you should be doing through Power Query, but there is actually a pretty in-depth object model that goes in tandem with XML objects. Pretty interesting. Regardless, so let's just kind of start off. I'm going to show you how to add a connection from an existing connection file. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to declare our object variables, like always, because it's all fun and all that kind of fun stuff. So the first thing that we need to do is we're going to create a new variable called source workbook. Well, this will be our workbook where all of our connections exist. And then we also are going to create a new variable called workbook connections. And this one is actually a connections collection. So these are all the individual workbook connection objects that currently exist in your workbook. Now, after we've done that, I'm going to put this down a little bit. We can reference the current workbook. And so what we're going to do is we're going to set that source workbook object variable equal to this workbook. There we go. So this is the one that's housing our code. And then from here, we're going to create a reference to the connection collection. Connection collection. And with this one, it's going to be set workbook connections equal to source workbook dot connections. So this is, again, all the connections that currently exist in your workbook. Now from here, there is the capability to add a connection from an existing connection file. Now, if you don't know what a connection file is, I'll give you a little bit of a reminder, but on the previous video, I showed you that we can actually export our connection to a file, and it's called an ODC connection, file type. And if you open it using like Notepad or something, it's basically just an XML document. And so inside this XML document, you're specifying different things. For example, the connection type, you're specifying the connection string. Additionally, you're specifying the command type and the query itself. Just as a little bit of a note, I actually changed that query. So in the previous video, it was coming from the sales worksheet. Now it's coming from the employees worksheet. So even though I manually changed it in here, I'm going to show you that that doesn't really mean anything. We can actually still use this just as we've currently been using it. So it's really neat. And it really does kind of make things pretty cool when you think about it. Now, I do need to make sure that some of my stuff is not overlapping the other one, because I can't, for sales. You know what I'm going to do? Just to be a little bit safe, I'm going to give this a different name because I don't think it's going to work if I try to do it. I'll call it for employees. Just something that way it's a slightly different, just in case there's no errors that might arise from that. So how do we add this using VBA? Well, let me first... Oh, those are all my old notes. I don't care about those. So what we're going to do is add a connection from an existing connection file. So we're going to call our Workbook Connections collection, add from file. There is a file name argument. And so with the file name argument, you basically specify the file path. And if you're like me, you just go to Properties, Security, and then you want to just copy that file path because that's basically where it's pointing to. And then I'll also show you where it goes to by default if you add it and export it. Because if you export it, it goes to a very specific location that Excel will look at. There is an optional argument called create model connection. This one I set equal to false. In fact, when I didn't set it equal to false, I actually got some issues. It actually crashed my Excel, and it could have just been something where I missed something or whatever, but I don't know. I don't know if that's going to necessarily be an issue where when you're adding from file that it could potentially have a hiccup. I would be surprised if it does because a lot of times, they wouldn't add it if you can't do it, but that's not to say it's always, consistently working. But from here, if we add it, I ran it, didn't seem like it did that much, but hopefully when we go here, you will now see that there is a connection to that employees one. So we just added that connection file by specifying the path. Now there's some interesting things here. Where is it? I think it's users, Alex, documents, my, where is it? Where would they put it? Well, here's an easy way of doing it. I can't remember where I put it, but where is it? Tables. There's a way where you can actually export it if you need it. Used in, not that one. We'll just do this one. Properties, and if you go to definition, you can export it. Okay, there it is. Okay, so it puts it in my OneDrive. Why would it put it there? But regardless, I just need that. I just need the file path. Anywho, basically what I was trying to get to was this wonderful little folder. But basically, this is where if you export it, it's going to go to by default. Now, it doesn't mean you can't move it from here, but this is a special place because Excel will look at it if you do want to import it. So naturally, if you move it out of here, it's not going to be seen. And that can, create an issue sometimes. So just be aware that if you do move it, there is that potential where it might not work exactly like it did before. So, just keep that in mind as you're exporting it. You can move it, but there's some consequences to that. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's move on to the next portion. So we've now added this connection. Let's start going through the process of actually manipulating connections. Now, really what this is kind of demonstrating is there's different types of connections and there's different types of information about our connection, and you can access that information from VBA. So we'll create a new subroutine. We'll say manipulate workbook connections. The reason I do it as kind of a separate subroutine is because, I've already created one. It's really easy to, break things by starting to add connections that already exist. VBA can sometimes freak out and then it doesn't really know what to do. So this way I just tend to find it's a little bit more I would say, reliable. But we can reuse some of our code. There's nothing stopping me from doing that. I am going to create a new variable, though. I'm going to call it Workbook Connection. And this one is actually just a Workbook Connection object. So this one's not really that fancy. It's just a regular workbook connection. So it's just an individual one from our collection. And from here, I can copy that one. So this is just, again, reiterating things we've already done from the previous subroutine. But from here, we're going to start looping through these collections, right? So loop through each connection in our workbook. Now, because this portion is kind of just more, I would say, typing than anything, I do kind of want to just, use some code that I already have, and we'll kind of just walk through it a little bit. You can kind of look at it and see what, what's going on. But for the most part, we're just really printing some information. We're not necessarily doing a crazy lot at this point. We're just trying to get a feeling for what exactly are we seeing here. So the first thing I do is, if you work with an individual connection object, you will know that each connection has a name. So that basically is the name of that particular connection. There is a type. So we've kind of discussed that up here. And then additionally, there is a description. Now, in some cases, you might not have defined a description. So in some cases, these might be blank. In other cases, they're not going to be blank. So for example, this would never be blank. And I don't even think you can create a connection without giving it a name. So these two, I know for a fact, have to basically be there. This one does not necessarily have to be there. Regardless, I want to make sure I have my line break. Where's my line break? There's my line break. What we're going to do from here is we're just going to print out that information. So nothing fancy. Okay, so I have a company data one, which is of type 4. Type 4 is a text connection. I have one, which is OLEDB, and then my SQL one that was also doing OLEDB. And then one is OLEDB. So pretty much they're all OLEDB. That's kind of pointless. But the other thing from this too is a lot of it is technically, like I said, once it goes through Power Query, you're kind of restricted. Like it's pretty much going to be the same thing. But from here, what we can do is, for example, maybe I want to load this into the model, right? So I'll just do load to, and then I'll say, hey, you know what? I actually want to import. Might be delayed. Oh, okay. Well, we're going to lose it for a second, so bear with me. Oh, well, it kept it. But supposedly now it should be in Power Query, right? So now it should be there, and there's this workbook data model, right? So now if I go into my Power Query, sorry, not Power Query, Power Pivot, I should now see my table, right? So that's kind of neat. And then also from here, there's other connections, and you can actually see all of your existing connections from Power Pivot. God, good Lord. I cannot say it tonight. But yeah, so basically the idea from this is, you can access that stuff from here as well. So now it would be kind of interesting. Does this change anything from the workbook collection, Workbook Connections collection perspective? Well, look at that. So now we've actually got two different connections. Now we got a data model connection, and then we still have our original SEC query connection, which is related to Power Query. So now we've got like these weird components that go along with it. Be a little bit careful with your data model ones, because that is a really easy way to, again, make Excel very upset with you, where you're doing things like, oh, well, I'm just going to delete my data model connection. Okay, you can do that, and you'll probably get a not so happy ending. So basically, you just want to be careful when you start deleting and modifying connections and you really don't know what they're impacting. It can cause issues. So from here, basically what I'm doing is I'm checking to see what the connection type is as I'm looping, right? So every connection has a type. Those connection types have their own unique properties. So for example, if I had an OLEDB connection, that is its own object inside the object model. How do you know that? How did you know that, Alex? Well, I read the documentation, but if I actually look at IntelliSense, you'll notice that data feed connection, model connection, ODBC. So it's weird. It's almost like, why are there like all these different types of connections? It's because from the object model hierarchy, they all have their own little unique connection types. So because each one of those connections can have their own unique properties. So I am going to add one though, because right now I'm actually missing the data model one, but maybe we can fix that. So what I'll do is I'll do Excel, Control-J, connection type, and I'll do model. So if it's a model one, I'll do model connection, control, and then I'm gonna do command, I'll do ADO connection. I hope that doesn't break it. We'll see. But really all I'm doing is I'm just taking each one of my connections, I'm determining its type, and then based on its type, I might go and just get some additional information. So for example, my OLEDB connections, I want to know the command text, so that's basically like the actual query. I want to know my source data file, so where's this data coming from? My connection, so I want to know like the actual connection string. I want to know the command type, so the type of command text. And then I also look at use local connection, but there's other things in here too. So for example, there's save passwords. That's just basically going to tell us like, do we save the password for this connection? Like if we're going to like a data source where you have to authenticate yourself. There might be some methods where we can reconnect to this connection or refresh it. So if the data is old, then sometimes we might want to, refresh the data. There's make connection. So what we could do, I think, again, if you look down actually here at the OLEDB connection, there are some methods. So make connection. So with this one, you're actually creating a new connection to it. So say it doesn't currently exist in the workbook. You can actually make that connection. So you can add it, but you don't actually, that's interesting. Because to me, well, I guess you could do it in reverse. You could create the OLEDB connection object, and then you could add that connection object to the workbook. So I guess you could technically do that. Yeah, I guess you could. It'd be a little weird, I think, at first, but I could see where that would be probably advantageous, where you create the connection object first, and you define all the aspects about it, and then you finally add it to the workbook. Because just because you create this connection doesn't necessarily mean you want to actually add it to the workbook. There might be situations where you don't want to do that. But you would do that using the make connection method. And then there's save as ODC. So this is basically like you're exporting it. So that's kind of neat as well. So we could export this if we wanted to. So I can sit there and say, hey, export it. So I could say, hey, take my, again, I don't know if it's going to necessarily work, but we'll do workbook, workbook connection .OLEDB connection. And then where is it? Save as ODC. And then we'll do this, and I think there's a name, and if there's not, then I know this one has a name. This is assuming that everything works wonderfully and that there's no issues with any of this. But yeah, so I think that should work. So let's see what happens, because really all I'm doing is I'm just kind of going through. Additionally here, I'm just kind of looping through and seeing kind of what information there is about my particular connections. Oh, I didn't like that. let me see what it says. Oh, that's kind of neat. So now you can see all the type, you can see the description, the command text, all that, and the name. It didn't obviously like this. I'm kind of curious to see if I just convert it to a string. Sometimes like you have to be really specific, as I've learned. Yeah, I guess maybe not. I don't know. There might be something you have to kind of do, and it might be restricted. I'm gonna have to do a little bit more research on that one. But keep in mind there is, I guess, a way to do it. But the idea behind it is now with this unique connection type, you can go and get some extra information about it. And so basically from here, all I'm doing is I am just seeing all the information. And this is actually kind of interesting too, because if you actually look at the ADO connection for the data model one, it's quite interesting if you think about it, because Microsoft OLAP, and then what is it? Persist security info, true. Initial catalog, Microsoft SQL Server analysis services. And that actually makes sense because remember, Power Pivot and Power Query are built on top of some of the SQL engines. So that's kind of interesting. And then we kind of see this recurring pattern embedded. We saw with Power Query, there was one that was Workbook. So that's kind of interesting as well. Compatibility, safety options, MDX missing member mode, subquery 0, optimize response 7, update isolation level. So in other words, the connection string for that one is a pain. That one looks like a mess of one, but it is available if we want it. And then I think that's it for doing that. For the final portion, I am going to show you that you can technically go through and delete all of your connections. Be very, very careful with this. Very careful with this. It's really easy to get things messed up. In fact, so basically, the first things first is everything is pretty much identical. We're still looping and all that stuff. Do not try to delete a workbook data model connection. It is not going to like you at all. And if you do that, you will cause all sorts of havoc and your Excel will crash. So what I recommend is, I'm actually going to modify this a little bit just to make it a little bit more safe, because I guess technically I've never tried changing the connection name for the workbook model. I don't know if you technically could. You might be able to. But I think the safer route is really just to make sure that you're not working with a connection type model, because that way for sure, like, okay, it's not going to do it. Regardless, we loop through each connection. We check the connection type and we make sure it's on a model one. Here, I'm just printing out some stuff. And then I call the delete method on my workbook connection. So after I do that, it deletes it. And so then it's gone. It's no longer going to be there. And then all I say is that, hey, it's been deleted. And something I do here is I also grab the current count. So, just because it is a collection, you can, you can count a collection, so you can still leverage that functionality. And then all I'm saying is like, okay, so there's currently like, 1 or 2 connections in there. There should be 1 because our data model one shouldn't be deleted, but the other ones all should be deleted. Connection has been deleted. Oh, I see what happened. Workbook connection name. Oh, interesting. Well, that's kind of odd. So even though it's not the type, oh, I don't like that. Maybe that's why I had it there to begin with. That's weird though. It should still work. Yeah, it's still the same thing. Hold on. Let's do this. I guess I didn't like it. Let's just start from the beginning. Okay, does not equal. Sorry. Why did I? Oh, God. It's because I wasn't doing this does not equal. God, it's so frustrating sometimes. This is the joy of coding. You write it, and then you make a stupid little mistake like that, and then magically it doesn't work. This is how it was supposed to work. It was supposed to tell you, hey, I'm about to delete something. So it's telling me it's being deleted. And then it's going to go through and delete all of the connections. And so what this is now telling us is that if I go back here, I should go to my connections and I should see there's none. So keep in mind though, just because we delete the connection doesn't necessarily mean it's completely gone. We can still have references to it. So there are connection files that still exist on my particular, my particular desktop. So that is possible. In fact, this is actually kind of interesting because I think this is when we were trying to export it before and it said it didn't like it. Clearly it looks like it did because it just exported some that it didn't look like it was supposed to. So if I go to my OneDrive and I go to my documents and my data sources, oh, so it did export some of them, it looks like. So we've got our employee sales. I've got my stock database. That's kind of cool. What else we got in here? Ah, very cool. So it looks like the exporting did work. It looks like on just one of them, it didn't like it. I have a feeling that it was probably related to my text file connection because text file connections can be a little bit more challenging. Those ones are, again, because they're deprecated, sometimes they can create an issue sometimes. So, interesting. But hopefully now you have at least a somewhat of a higher level understanding of connection objects inside the Excel VBA object model. Other than that, if you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments below, and I will do my best to kind of help you through the process of working with these wonderful, yet sometimes very fickle objects. So very interesting stuff. I do like them, but yes, they can be a little bit challenging. In our next video, we are going to work with a Power Query connection. That's kind of my big priority right now, is I do want to get that one out of the way, just because from I would say an organization perspective, that's going to look very different than the other ones that we're going to do. The other ones we're going to do, they're going to look almost identical to what we've seen with the Excel Workbook one. The Power Query one, though, that's a little bit of a different story. So that one kind of warrants its own little video. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments below. Otherwise, we will see you in the next video.